Hello, everyone. I am so incredibly excited to be joined today by David Pakman, who is the host of the David Pakman Show. He is the author of the Echo Machine. He runs a brilliant Substack as well. I am so thrilled to have you join us today on American Inequality.
Thanks for having me.
Terrific. So let us dive in because David, you have done a lot, of work and spent a lot of time deconstructing, arguments from policymakers, politicians. Can you walk us through some of these, kind of recent claims, that you're hearing really in some of these, political or policy circles, common talking points that initially sound reasonable, but they start to really fall apart once you examine the assumptions, evidence, or logic behind it?
Yeah, I mean, one is the economy's bad because the government has spent so much money over, whatever period of time, and missing from that conversation are so many things. You could just talk about housing, for example, and all of the regulatory history or lack thereof as to how housing got so expensive. And you can talk about technological impacts on wages and productivity. You can talk about antitrust law that the country has but isn't really enforced and how that's caused things to cost more in the United States. So, I think that's one where it's often, hey, listen, the only real problem is the government spending too much and we've got to cut what the government is spending. That's one I've been following. Another is around labor participation and
Mm,
both in terms of raw numbers and the labor participation rate. And a lot of politicians love to play games with this. Well, depending on what's convenient, they'll say the total number of people working is higher than ever, or the total people working is lower. The total number of people not working is higher than ever. Or if the number's not convenient, they'll go with the rate. They'll go the percentage that's working or not working is higher than ever. And the truth is that it really doesn't tell you very much. Like on the one hand, in a country where the population continues to increase, it stands to reason that you might hit new high numbers in all of these categories at different points in
right.
time. It won't really tell you that much. But the other thing is, people can exit the labor pool for reasons that are indicative of a strong or a weak economy. So, like, for example, if the economy is good enough for people to be able to retire, you'll see people leave the labor pool and they go from I'm in the labor participation, now I'm in not participating. But that's not because the economy is bad. It's because it's good enough that they were able to afford retiring. And so a lot of these numbers don't really communicate much, even though politicians love to use them to make whatever case they want to make.
Yeah, I think one I was seeing, recently was about like the tremendous rise in millionaires in the US, that the US added, something like, 1,200, millionaires every single day in 2025. And that was an, incredible, number. And it was, startling for a lot of folks. But I think, when you put that into perspective about like, the population size of the US and sort of what the growth we were seeing in some other areas, and you started to look at like the rate increase that the US actually wasn't even, kind of like the leading country there. Are you seeing basically that when, some of these arguments are being presented, like this is actually really a question of how we're presenting the data and the numbers on it? Or are they actually missing some or failing to present some of the like assumptions and some of their arguments around, housing or immigration or the economy in general?
I think it's both. I mean, with the labor participation rate one, I think it's the context that's missing as to it's very easy to just say there's more people than ever not working right now. But we really, if you want to do this thoughtfully, you have to first think about what you're measuring. You have to think about why are we measuring that and what else might we measure if what we're trying to ascertain is something broader about the state of the economy or the state of employment. So that is kind of completely skipped. And then the analysis I just did of how these numbers can go up and down for reasons that point positively or negatively. I mean, I think all of that is missing. And also, I think sometimes sometimes the data is not accurately presented, but even when it is, you really do need the context to understand some of these things. Another one is This one you don't see as much lately, but it was really common when it was George W. Bush as president and Barack Obama as well, which is when there's when an unemployment rate is cited, which usually we're talking about the U3. There's a bunch of different unemployment rates that you can use, but generally speaking, when we're talking about 4.2% or the one that's often in that range, we're talking about the U3. Depending on what political point is kind of sought, you will hear the claim, oh, but that doesn't include all of these other categories of people. And that is true. Like there's the U6 and there's other metrics. But going back 50 years, we're basically talking about the U3 when we talk about unemployment. So, like, while it may be true that there are other metrics that measure other things, it would be dishonest or misleading to only choose the U6 when the U3 isn't politically convenient. And so that's another one, although I don't see that as much lately.
Yeah, I was about to ask if we feel like, this is a unique time for some of those kind of like manipulations of logical arguments, right? Or that, we are selectively revealing or hiding assumptions in some of these arguments. It sounds like what you're saying is we have seen this tale before, right? Where some of the arguments, politicians, they, show and hide, certain arguments at times. Or do you think that right now we're living in a moment where that selection bias has actually perhaps magnified?
I think this is always something that there have been attempts to do, but the kind of siloed nature of social media, because of how algorithms kind of tend to keep people exposed to the sorts of things that they already favor or believe, I think that that has accelerated the effectiveness of some of these talking points. So I don't think the use of them is new, but I think how prevalent they've become is related to the experience most of us have on these digital platforms.
Yeah, and I know another area that you have spent some time talking about is really about some of the absurdity of a lot of the claims that we're seeing too, and bad faith arguments that are often presented on prime time, and I think that perhaps lends itself to a kind of furthering of these incorrect claims, incorrect data. And I think we are living in a time where you see people pushing further and further out, whether that's because they think that is what is going to resonate on social media or get them airtime. But that wasn't always the case, where you had to like really push these totally absurdist arguments in order to, get people to listen to you or get people to click on your, articles and things like that.
I think that's true. And during the 2024 presidential campaign, when this story about Haitian immigrants eating cats and dogs kind of went viral, there was an interview where the current vice president, J.D. Vance, actually said, essentially justifying the creation of these stories, saying we are going to create the narratives we want because the media is so bad and it's fake, and sort of like justifying, like, yes, some of these things may not be literally true in the sense that they don't adhere to facts, but we feel justified in creating these narratives anyway, which is quite a remarkable statement, quite frankly.
Right. I think I remember at the time J.D. Vance even talking about how he was like, well, it doesn't even matter if it's true because the sentiment is true, or, what it conveys about what is going on in America. That part is true. And I think that is a really dangerous place for us to be in. I want to link this up, to another area that I know you spent, kind of quite a bit of time digging into, which is the disconnect between economic statistics and how people, kind of feel about the economy every day. And I think this is where you start to get into this bit of a messier area too, where we actually maybe don't always have data on what is, kind of occurring for people in the economy, or it's not really the types of things that get, published, that we get the New York Times push notification about a 4.2%. This was also an area where when I was at the Federal Reserve, I spent a lot of time trying to look at what are some of the measures that we're not really, analyzing, that prevent us from seeing the full picture of the economy. Is it, is this one of the areas as well where it's okay for, politicians and policymakers to start like drawing on some of these data that are maybe hiding underneath the surface or aren't, as well publicized, because it actually helps us better see what's going on in the world? Or you're like, we have these core statistics for a reason, and those are the ones that we should really lean on.
Yeah, I think different scenarios lend themselves to different data being useful, and there's a lot of ways to be dishonest with just taking a statistic and abstracting it from its broader context. I've been talking with my audience, for example, about the percentage of car loans that are delinquent, which I think is a really interesting metric because it can actually be a leading indicator rather than seeing a circumstance and saying, here's how I can justify what's going on by telling you what the GDP was or what the number of jobs created was. But you kind of start to look at this building pressure on the economy of how many people are falling behind to the point of being delinquent on car loans. And it's interesting for two reasons. One is that it's a leading indicator about what may be happening, something that may not yet have bubbled up into some of the common statistics that you see, but also because in a lot of the country, not in some of the biggest cities, but in a lot of the country, having access to a vehicle is what allows you to work, both in the literal sense of that's how you get to work, and this is how you get your kids to school. And if they're not in school, you're not able to work. So I think delinquency on car loans is just to pick one example, I think is one that does not get a lot of attention, but can be really informative as to sort of like what may be coming in the economy.
Right. And that one is so interesting as it relates to, the housing crisis, for example, where we also, started to see like this rising delinquency, in, mortgage payments and rental payments and sort of like what that people at the time got very worried about, the economy overheating. But when we think about it for cars, it's different because, perhaps it's much easier to repossess a car than it is to repossess a home and what that says. But you're totally right that it breaks down a lot of these, linkages to economic well-being, whether it's childcare or education or, work as well. For you about some of these like connections between how we can improve, people's like economic well-being and how they're feeling about the economy, is helping them with car payments one of those ones where you feel like it's kind of these like kind of core linchpin pieces, or just feel more for you that, childcare is where we need to be spending more of our time addressing some of these, issues? I know you've, touched a brief, bit as well on some of this kind of adjacent housing, narrative of everything and all that. Like, where do you see we need to be making some of these biggest pushes to be addressing sort of some of these like economic ruptures that people are feeling?
Well, I mean, we'll start with cars. I don't know that I need the government necessarily more involved in helping people make car payments, but we do have a system that it can be very predatory with regard to these subprime car loans and, put 30% down and we'll roll negative equity from the last car into the new loan. And then all of a sudden, it's a depreciating asset to begin with, but people start upside down on it. I mean, I think that getting into those situations in the first place is a big part of the problem, but I think there's sort of bigger fish to fry. And it's really housing, healthcare, education, and childcare. Those would be the four areas I would focus. And different parts of the country have different situations with some of those. Also, there's a big urban-rural divide in terms of that. But those are sort of like the four areas that I would focus in on.
Housing, healthcare, education, and childcare. Jobs are not in there, noticeably. And it seems like there's, a tremendous amount of conversation around jobs and AI job loss. Are jobs not in there because we actually feel like we're actually in an okay with employment and we're not as, kind of worried about some of these, mass job losses? Or it feels like these, if we have those four in place, that jobs will kind of, follow from that construct.
A lot will follow from that construct because so much of the negotiating power that people don't have with regard to prospective jobs comes from, if you take housing, number one, disproportionately expensive housing based on where the jobs are. So people who take jobs or consider taking jobs in area A with that salary wouldn't be able to afford housing in that same area. And so this displaces labor in a way that is problematic, people long commutes, et cetera. So if we could deal with housing costs, healthcare, a lot of times people take or stay in jobs they hate, meaning they're not productive in them anyway. So it's not good for the employer and it's not good for the employee because most people's health insurance is tied to employment. So you deal with that, you're going to impact the job market. And we could sort of go down the line. When it comes to childcare, a lot of people depend on the childcare situation is what either allows them or does not allow them to take one job versus another. So it's not that I don't care about jobs, but I think that these four areas are so widely applicable and touch so many areas of the economy that the impact would sort of trickle into employment.
Why do you think more policymakers don't frame the healthcare challenges as labor market challenges, sort of in that same way that you did, right? That healthcare creates all these, job lock, issues, and that, improving, our healthcare and access to healthcare could actually be this labor market tool that could spur entrepreneurship and worker mobility and things like that. Like, why is it that those conversations tend to be more siloed?
Either they haven't thought of it or they don't think it would work. I mean, I think it's got to be one of those two things. I do remember there was a period, maybe I don't know now if it was like around the 2016 presidential primaries or maybe 2020, when I think this idea of decoupling health insurance from employment and that being an indicator of freedom. This gives you the liberty to really look for the job that speaks to you and this sort of thing. I do have some memory of that being more part of the narrative, but it really wasn't in 2024, and it's not a part of the conversation today either.
Right. And there are, yeah, I mean, many folks who I'm, good friends of mine now who are like kind of really, very much so dealing with that, question. I think it's also deeply linked to the childcare options, how people are thinking about, kids, IVF, the affordability, right, of raising kids, the different healthcare plans, that your employer options, and people stay in these jobs that they don't otherwise want, preventing others from maybe applying to those jobs that they do want that could give them that, economic mobility or kind of, foothold into the middle class, but people remain stuck sort of in those, jobs. Are there folks that you have, kind of been talking to? I know you do, quite a bit of, connecting with people on, who are deeply involved politically. We were just chatting before this about, you had a conversation recently with Gavin Newsom, for his podcast. Are there folks where you're like, oh, this, politician, this group, is really actually helping move forward on, some of these economic challenges that they're disaggregating these things? Or you're saying like, actually, in fact, we have really a long way to go?
We do have a long way to go, and there are people that are doing things that I think are good. It's also really important to distinguish if you are a member of the House of Representatives or the Senate in Washington, D.C., the way that you affect change usually is through legislation that is federal. On the other hand, or maybe it's obtaining earmarks for your district for improving one service or another service or something like that. Governors are different in that they're really administrators of their states. And so I think even like how we measure, has a governor or a senator done more on housing? It's like, well, those are the levers that each of them have are very different. And I think that that's something that's important to consider. When it comes to governors, especially of states as large as California, are managing so many different things that you could simultaneously, as I think you could make the case while Gavin Newsom has been governor, that there have been advances. So the average asking rent in California has come down about $100 over the recently measured, I don't know if it was the last year or year and a half or something like that. I mean, listen, that by definition means housing has become marginally more affordable. It's still really expensive in California, but you could say, okay, put that in the checkbox of like, that's good. On the other hand, I don't know that homelessness has really been dealt with in any serious manner that is visibly improved. There have been small things done. So it's so politicized that it's really hard to cut through and go, here's the net of affordability in California under a particular governor. And I know some people love Gavin Newsom and some people hate Gavin Newsom. We can find things that happen under any governorship that some of us would say are good and some of us would say aren't good. But it can be very difficult to sort of like give a final grade, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. It's a big part of why at American Equality we try and drill down to the county level and often for communities, because I think particularly in a place like California, Texas, New York, what is happening in the northern part of the state is so different than what is happening in the southern part of the state. Even within, really big cities like LA, you have such different challenges depending on the different neighborhood you're at, where, poverty rates can basically double from one block to the next. And so I think trying to drill down to those areas not only reflects how people are actually experiencing, America, but also helps us better tactically change what is going on in these communities. In, California, the rental difference basically between living in Oakland versus living in San Francisco is now an 81% basically difference in rent. In 2016, it was only a 33%. And then part of that is because Oakland decided to build a lot of new housing that is now basically starting to, come online, and this kind of helped keep, rental prices much lower there. But just talking about, housing or affordability in California generally really doesn't do a lot of nuance in there, especially in San Francisco, where like being near downtown San Francisco, like there are parts of Oakland that are closer there than it is, just generally for, areas that are further out in San Francisco. I very much so agree that trying to understand some of those like regional nuances is quite important, especially for these really thorny issues.
Yeah, 100%. And that's why, the fact that the average asking rent has gone down $100 doesn't tell you, doesn't even indicate that it's gone down everywhere. And as you're pointing out, there are areas where it's gone up.
Let us talk about affordability then, and, where you are seeing sort of like this conversation emerge, because I think for a long time, you know, um, we've seen like both sides of the aisle actually, for a while now trying to talk about affordability. We're seeing some of these interesting policy interventions. We're seeing the conversation really evolve here. Affordability, I think, is really tied into these, big four that you have touched on of housing, healthcare, education, and childcare. How do we start moving the needle on these things? Does it feel like it has to happen at the federal level? Does it start, on one of these four levers? Does it begin in communities? And yeah, areas again as well where you have seen like, okay, this, group or state, or governor is actually really helping, on this affordability angle.
I think it has to be both. I think on housing, some federal legislation on housing would be great, but a lot of it also is about zoning that comes down either to, in some cases, it's at the state level, in some cases, it's even at the municipality level. And I think the supply just needs to be rapidly grown. That's number one. Now, what's constricting supply? In some cases, it's zoning. In some cases, it's permitting. In some cases, it's the cost of materials. And these things can kind of change over time, but I do think that it's both federal and state and local. On healthcare, there's been a shift in the conversation on affordability. It used to be all about what percentage of people are uninsured, but the conversation has kind of shifted now into, even when you have insurance, which most people do, what are you out of pocket for in terms of premium? And then what are your copays? And like, what's the totality of what you're actually paying in a year relative to your salary? The people who are uninsured, that's still an issue, and that's still something we're talking about. But I have seen the conversation evolve into what people with insurance are paying, and also what are the wait times, what is the quality of the care that you have access to. Another example would be on transportation. I think there's been a bit of a change, and
Yeah.
that's very much urban versus rural and suburban, because the conversations and the issues are very different. In cities, of course, there's a lot more talk about public transit, whether Uber and Lyft and similar services shouldn't be allowed, what's the impact on other forms of public transit, etc. In more rural areas, it's more about gas prices, which feels
Mm,
much more directly salient, especially to people who have on average longer commutes. So I don't, it's rarely the case that with any of these areas, it's like, the problem is federal and it's about gas prices or something. It's far more complicated.
right. And I think this is, an area that you have done such a nice job of like kind of reflecting the nuance here about what are those different issues in these different subject matter areas. But I'm also, struggling a bit because these narratives are often so unsexy in many ways, right? Like talking about,
Yeah.
you know, zoning and parking minimums and premiums and copays, like those aren't really the things that I think like get people out of it. I mean, I do have many policy wonk friends who like parking, is the most exciting thing that they've ever talked about. But are these the types of like narratives that are winning for affordability, or is it more on like here are the things that we can tell you about your kid is, gas prices, like is it about those everyday expenses, even though we know that some of these more like technocratic changes are actually the things that can really unleash changes for communities?
Well, this is why I have a book forthcoming called Pay Attention. And I talk, in addition to, the siloed nature of those who spend time on digital platforms, there's this other aspect where I just think the political right has a great advantage because a lot of their arguments lend themselves very well to pithy and emotionally salient in a way that a lot of the stuff I'm talking about just kind of doesn't. I mean, it's much more interesting to go, hey, listen, you earn that money. They're stealing when they collect taxes. Like that's very simple and pithy and interesting. And of course, the opposite of that argument is not the government should take 100% of the money you make. It's, well, yeah, listen, it would be great to keep as much money as possible and you decide what to do with it. And also we know from studying sociology and psychology that you've got to centralize some of these decisions because otherwise you've got every road is owned by somebody else and you've got competing police departments. And so like you've got to find a happy medium of what's the right level of taxation that allows society. We've lost everybody. Like it's
Right.
not as interesting. It doesn't do well on TikTok. It doesn't do well on Instagram. So I think that this is like an uphill battle for the political left.
Yeah, getting them to pay attention, figuring out how to do it. And I think, yeah, recognizing like the reality of where a lot of these policy conversations are happening. I think there was forget if it was in the Times this morning about how more and more people are turning to, LLMs right before elections in particular about, who should I vote for, what information, can get. Just last week, we had on, Amanda Littman with Run for Something, talking about how politicians are trying to help inform how chatbots are talking about them there too. And so living in this time of like ever changing narratives, how we get the message out, I think is quite critical. How we can get people, to listen to those. And then once you get in office, feel like you are still, achieving those goals and not just like the pithy headline of it, and also staying true to things, not doing the JD Vance and saying like,
Right.
well, we give you this idea of they're eating the cats and the dogs, and that's like what our stand-in policy is for being, anti-immigration.
Yeah.
Um, I want us to kind of, wrap up a bit talking about, this question that we sort of always wrap up with, which is the path forward, areas where we can think about how we can improve, some of the national dialogues and these issues of affordability. Again, trying to touch on like who have you seen, really start to, move forward some of these conversations as we are, thinking about what narratives hold weight and which ones, don't. Because I think there's still a tremendous amount of work that we see that communities can still do. So what's the path forward for individuals, nonprofits, or government change makers to help improve equality in the US?
Well, I mean, there's a lot of very big picture stuff, and this isn't where I can assign it to any one particular office. But the things I would like to see are number one, we really do need to have a voting system and an election system at the top for even choosing who will represent us that does give people confidence that the will of the people is going to be represented. And what I mean by that is not like this whole like elections are rigged sort of stuff, but when I look at the gutting of the Voting Rights Act and these attempts to shut down early polling places and mail-in voting, intimidate voters potentially with ICE at the polls, et cetera. First of all, it's people need to have buy-in and need to be involved. And in order to get them involved, they need to be confident about what their experience is going to be participating in the election system. That's number one. You've got to deal with gerrymandering because gerrymandering is a factor that makes it so that our representatives don't reflect the political orientation of the people. Where if you have a state that's divided 60-40 in one way, but the representatives are divided, 70-30 the other way politically, that's not representative. So I think we've got a lot of these structural things. We've got to get money out of politics, look at public financing of election. So there's kind of like the election package, I guess I would start with. We then, I believe, need to really enforce the laws we already have. There's so much talk of, I would propose this and I would pass that and all of this other stuff. As a first step, we have antitrust legislation in the United States. It's really rarely enforced and leads to higher prices and enriches those who own the corporations
Yeah.
and stockholders. So before we even get to like new legislation, we should really robustly enforce the legislation that we have. So I would say that that's sort of number two. And then I would also deal with courts. We have court systems up to and including the Supreme Court in the United States, which on average tend to side with the party with more power. Now, the reason I say it that way is you could say with corporations over individuals. That's not really accurate. Like sometimes that's the way it layers, but not necessarily. But we need to deal with our court system. I'm not a fan of lifetime appointments personally, especially to the Supreme Court. So there's a lot of these different structural issues that I think unless and until we deal with those, arguing about multi-use versus commercial zoning, it's very important. It's very important. But we're missing the forest for the trees until we deal with these structural issues.
Yeah, I think you've really done a great job of capturing those structural ones, not only kind of in those, kind of four big pillars, but these, three as well about how we can, improve our democracy, enforce our legislation, and yeah, improve our courts. One thing we talk a lot about on, American inequality is how if we just collected all of the taxes that were owed, we would immediately tomorrow raise $175 billion, which could wipe out poverty in the US. And I agree that there is a lot of, what's the next new shiny thing that I can, hang my hat on and say that I passed, but just making our country work the way that we intended to would really go a long way.
Yeah.
So thank you so much, David, for joining us on the show. Everyone should go check out his book. I dropped his Substack in the chat as well. Folks can also check out the recording, which will go live later tonight or tomorrow morning. But I am Jeremy Ney with American Inequality, and we will see you all again soon.
Thanks so much for having me. Take care.
You too.